The Ukrainians might have widened their bridgehead on the Dnipro. Russians have bigger successes at Avdiivka. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief Zaluzhnyi writes an essay about the current state of the war, and a Russian bomber pilot being probably killed by the Ukrainian intelligence agency 500 kilometers behind the front line. This and more about the war in Ukraine in the Situation Report. We start off with some information about the donation campaign we ran lately. The fourth ambulance has now been bought and is on its way into Ukraine. The fifth one is probably going to be bought in a week. The negotiations are currently ongoing. In one of their strikes against Ukraine, Russians have not just taken out a thermal power plant, according to Ukraine. They also hit at least one grain silo. We see the picture here of big spillage. Obviously, grain silos can, under no reasonable circumstances, be a military target. At least I would like to know how that could be justified in any ways. This seems to be a clear and aimed attack at Ukraine's ability to continue exporting grain and thus sustaining its economy. Other than that, the Ukrainians strike back though. We see here fire in a refinery in Volgograd, the city that became famous in World War II under the name Stalingrad. The Russians are claiming that a drone they shot down hit the refinery. Whether this is the truth or whether the drone hit its target, its intended target, doesn't seem to make much of a difference. According to the Russian reports, the fire is extinguished by now. How high the damage is unclear. But then again, we have a strike here in the depth of the Russian territory, far behind the front line against infrastructure, once again being successful. In the attack on Belbek that I reported in the last situation report, a Russian General Alexander Tatarenko, was supposedly killed. This is the current claim. I have not seen a Russian confirmation yet, but it seems to be more or less true. Other sources talk about 3 damaged planes on the airfield. At the airfield, I have not seen visual evidence, even though there's supposed to be any. So I'm not sure whether I just missed those pictures. This claim I was not able to confirm either. The same, obviously, with the dead Russian general as of now. On the Eastern Front, we have fighting towards the attacks by the Russian. Kupiansk was under heavy air attack as well with gliding bombs, but I cannot confirm any fresh change in territory. The Russians are claiming they're getting closer and closer towards Terni. They're talking about being close to 2 kilometers by now towards the town, but again, I cannot confirm fresh changes in territory. South of the Siversky Donetsk, the fighting is also continuing, but here again, it's somewhat unclear how far of it, how big the changes are. There seems to be the sign that the Ukrainians were managing to push back the Russians somewhat on the ridgeline north of Bodanivka, and but I cannot fully confirm it as of now. And towards Ivanivske, the Ukrainians, I found Ukrainian sources confirming that the Russians had reached Ivanivske and even entered the first houses, but then were pushed back. And now Ivanivske is still, or again, fully under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are supposedly not far away. And if we look on the map here, by Deep State Map, that is basically confirming it. The gray zone reaching the outermost parts of the town, and the Russians not being far behind that. Further south, I cannot confirm any change in territory, and I have not even seen serious claims when it comes to the direction of Klishivka and Andriivka. The fighting is obviously the strongest and the heaviest around Avdiivka. Here, the Russians have had some serious success in the northern Dachas. In this area here, we have geolocalizations that point them right down here. You can see that here, that pond, and towards its west, where the main area of the town begin. So here the Russians were already spotted. This obviously gets them fairly close to the main north-south connection inside of Avdiivka, but to reach it they would have to cross serious built-up area, so further house-to-house fighting would be expected. It's unlikely that the Russians are going to cut it fairly soon, but should they be able to do it, then obviously the whole southern area would be in serious danger of being encircled. At the same time, Ukrainian troops are already in serious danger of being encircled, and that is south here in the bulge that has been built up south of the area where the Russians advanced through a sewage pipe and thus were able to bypass Ukrainian fortifications. The Ukrainians are still holding those positions here, and they are, as you can guess, heavily built up, as they have been the front line, more or less the front line, for those 8 years between Russia's invasion and Russia's full-scale invasion. And now not only have they been bypassed in the north, but the Russians have actually reached a critical point here at that position, where we also have a geolocalization where they were spotted right here. And you can see that this is more or less, those are the two connections that are running north-south. The Russians are in here, and they are now in danger of cutting this one off. Here I cannot confirm that they have taken that position, that they're still holding it, but we know they have been in here, and by looking at Google Maps you can even see the fortifications here. For instance, you see trench lines. Here you could see trench lines. This is a strong point of the Ukrainian defense. We have other ones that can be visible here, but now both of them are in danger of being cut off and bypassed, which would force the Ukrainians to retreat or stand there and be taken out, be destroyed. So this is likely going to lead to a Ukrainian withdrawal here, if this is true, and if the Ukrainians can't push them back. The only way to resupply them now is through those two roads. That should be a mud road from what I see. So right now the supply through it is probably fairly difficult as well, and the only protection from Russian attacks is a thin tree line that is obviously currently not carrying leaves. So the supply situation here in the south should be critical. As said, we should expect a soon withdrawal there, unless the Ukrainians can somehow get into better positions with counterattacks. There have been counterattacks in here. There is a video going around of a Ukrainian tank shooting a house from point blank range after the Ukrainian soldiers have been under fire from that house right before that. Whether the Ukrainians have been successful in pushing the Russians back is unclear. The more serious Ukrainian mill bloggers don't claim that, even though there were Ukrainian claims that they even took back the Tsaroska, I think is the name. Tsarska Ohota, the former restaurant here, which was previously a strong point. This seems to be untrue, so the Russians are very likely controlling most of this here, if not all, and the southern point is under serious pressure. Further south, I have no change that I can confirm, not here at Priutne, not here fresh changes at Opytne. Apart from obviously the Russians moving towards the east here. And when we go down further towards the direction of Krasnohorivka and of Georgivka, here we have a geolocalization again of a Russian advance that reached a position fairly bypassing you can more or less, we can orient towards this, let's call it, bridge between the two lakes. And if we look at it here, we see that the Russians have now been up here at that point. So they are pushing further east, and thus obviously endangering Krasnohorivka from the south should they advance further in this direction. At the same time, the Russians are attempting to bypass Novomikhailivka by advancing towards the west. We have a geolocalization in this regard as well of a lot of Russian destroyed equipment. So this attack was a failure. A lot of their equipment was destroyed. Another attack up here also got destroyed. Right now there's a lot of videos popping up of the Russian side suffering heavy losses, but regardless the losses, they keep coming and they keep slowly but steady. They keep advancing, at least as of now. Further south, I have no fresh changes except when we come to the direction of the oblast border between Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. Here, the Russians have advanced up to 2 kilometers close to Priyutne. I also have a geolocalization here. No, that's it. Where we see they have reached more or less that river here. They are up here already north from Priyutne and pushing the Ukrainians back from the area they retook in their counteroffensive. At Orikhiv, the information is unclear. There are some outrageous claims that the Ukrainians have recaptured Verbove. I do not see any serious change in territory. Wargonzo, one of the bigger Russian mill bloggers, claimed that the Russians had some success in the south and the Ukrainians at the same time somewhere in the north of Verbove, so roughly in these areas here. I do not see visual evidence, and as said, that they're currently circulating some claims that Verbove is retaken by the Ukrainians. That seems to be extremely unlikely as of now. Let's go. So while there are some rumors of changes here, I cannot confirm any again. At Krinky, there we have an unclear situation. Some Russian sources say that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians somewhat towards the west. They pushed them away. There is even some claim of a fresh landing close to Kosachi Lahiri. I do not see any visual evidence there once again. But at the same time, we know that the Russians have now pushed the Ukrainians back to the tree line. The Ukrainians are no longer in this forested area, and it seems extremely unlikely that the Ukrainians can muster forces for a serious counterattack that takes additional territory, as they suffer continuous losses through their supply runs over the Konka River, where Ukrainian boats are being hit by Russian FPV drones, and the Russians keep publishing those videos. So the Ukrainians are suffering losses, steady losses in the area. Some claims are that the Russian losses are so much higher that it's worth it. Whether or not, there's no way of me to confirm this, but I said that the Ukrainians would be able to do a serious advance there. More than 2 houses seems extremely unlikely. Still though, Colonel Natalia Humenyuk, who is the spokesperson of the Southern Command, is saying the Russians right now are losing 70% of each of their attack waves towards Krinky. So the Ukrainians claim to take out 70% in each attack. Whether that's actually the truth or not, obviously no way of confirming it. And at the same time, we do not know whether it's worth it, because we don't know how high the Ukrainian losses are, whether this attritional battle there is actually worth the cost for the Ukrainians is impossible to judge out of position from without knowing the details. If we go to the overall, when we go to the overall situation, Ukrainian spokesperson said the Russians have now concentrated 40,000 men, 500 MBTs, and 650 IFVs and APCs towards Kupiansk, together with 430 artillery pieces and 150 MLRS, so multiple launch rocket systems, which should mean that the Russians have concentrated a serious amount of heavy firepower towards the region here, and thus we should expect further advances by the Russians over the coming weeks. A Ukrainian analysis also said that the Russians have returned to static artillery positions. That was their initial way of doing it until the Ukrainians were gaining the upper hand in the artillery duel during the spring and summer of last year. This forced the Russians to be more flexible and get out of their usual ways. Now they have returned it, as stark reminder how stark the difference now is between the available shells for both sides, where Ukraine is getting towered by the amount the Russians are able to shoot. In it's 1 to 5 to 1 to 10 in many places. At the same time, according to that Ukrainian analysis that's run from a open source think tank run by Tatarigami, that's the nom de guerre from a Ukrainian officer, he said that the artillery is now often 15 to 24 kilometers beyond the front line, thus out of range of FPV drones. So if they lack the shells to do proper counter battery fire. The Ukrainians are more or less helpless against them as their sharpest sword. After that, the FPV drones can't even reach those. That obviously also means that the Russians are deliberately reducing their artillery range, as we are at a point where the 122 millimeter artillery from the Russians has already reached its maximum range, as well as older 152 pieces have more or less that range, so they can more or less shell the front line and a little bit behind it, but not any further into this. But at the same time, they are not losing personnel, they are not losing artillery pieces because of this, and they can shoot up Ukrainian positions. That was one of the complaints, that the Ukrainians can't do anything anymore to prevent the Russians from destroying Ukrainian held towns and then allowing the Russians to advance after this wave of artillery fire. In an essay published by General Zaluzhnyi, he is acknowledging that the West is going to give them less aid in the future as the Western allies are distracted because of political tensions. Again, we see what he writes what is obvious when we look at the number of promised goods, when we see that the fresh production in heavy weaponry is negligible in favor of Ukraine, whereas the West is mostly still sending what it has in stocks, even though there are some examples, like for instance, the French want to build, I think it was 72 César artillery pieces for Ukraine this year. The Polish are building 100 Rosomak. So while there is fresh production for Ukraine, it is nowhere close to that. And I have not heard until now that the Ukrainians are going to receive freshly built MBTs, at least not as of now. At the same time, he said that Ukraine needs to put hope on technical innovation, especially on drones, as its stockpile on rockets, on missiles and grenades is basically used up. So they have to focus mostly on innovation and drones, so FPV drones, and Ukraine must more and more rely upon itself, upon its own defense industry to make up for the diminished aid from the West. In general, he says in 2024, there has to be a concentration of three things. First, a system has to be created to provide the Ukrainian armed forces with high-tech assets. The second is that introducing a new philosophy of training and warfare, which takes account of restrictions in assets and how they can be deployed. So that they don't have as much as they want, and they need to learn how to handle their limited resources more efficiently. And the third conclusion is, and they need to master new combat capabilities as soon as possible, as obviously warfare has changed quite significantly. Generally, he says that the costs to wage war for Russia needs to be extended. That obviously includes political, economically, but also with deep strikes in the Russian rear. We see a campaign against Russian oil refineries in the last few days. Obviously, should those strikes be more successful, this will hurt Russia quite a lot, as oil is a big part, or probably the biggest part, in financing their war against Ukraine right now. Also, at the same time, we have claims that insiders in the US White House administration, whoever that is, we never know really well, but there are claims that Zelensky has informed the White House that he's going to dismiss Zaluzhnyi in the near future. As of now, as of this recording, I have not had a confirmation. The discussion about Zaluzhny's deposing is up since Monday this week, so whether it's going to happen or not is unclear. Obviously, it would be problematic, as Zaluzhnyi has a much higher confidence rate in the Ukrainian public than the Ukrainian president, and the soldiers trust in him as well. And at the same time, who would replace him? The rumors were that the majority of those who were qualified and up in rank to take that job had refused to even take over. At least those were the rumors that were being spread. In partisan information, we have partisan regards. There's the information that a Russian Tupolev 95 pilot was shot and probably killed in Engels. Engels is where the strategic bomber base is of the Russians, where they, among others, use Tupolev 95 to launch cruise missiles against Ukraine. The GOR says that this pilot was directly responsible to strike civilian targets inside of Ukraine. And they said, like, we know every war criminal, we know all your habits, we know where you live, and we're going to get you. So another strike in another area where the Russians would have to be more on edge from now on. In regards to troop generation, in a speech in front of defense industry officials, Putin said that in the last 16 months, 520,000 new jobs have been created in the defense industry. That would give us a perspective, unless that was obviously depending on how accurate those numbers are, but that would give us a perspective how the Russians are doing their best to increase their defense goods production. And at the same time, a company from Taiwan has in 2023 has been found out to have sold CNC machines towards Russia. Obviously, they can be used in defense production, and the government in Taiwan, in Taipei, is now reacting and is going to tighten its export regulations to prevent this in the future, as Taiwan has clearly sided with Ukraine in this war. In the political sphere, Putin spoke that Ukraine has to be pushed back so far, the Ukrainian control, that it can no longer threaten Russian territory with its weapons. Obviously, this is not really detailed, as Ukraine can always develop longer ranged weapons, and we see that Ukrainian drones can now reach 1,000 kilometers deep into the Russian rear. So how far does he want to push them back? And at the same time, it seems clear that Russia is not going to be satisfied even with the occupation of the 4 freshly annexed oblasts. Not to forget that Crimea was already annexed in 2014. He talked about Kharkiv as being a Russian city. He talked about, which is up here, and he talked about Odessa being a Russian city. And obviously, in his mind, that would have to be liberated, in quotation marks, from the Russian side as well. So that there is any willingness of Russia to make peace under a negotiation that is a little more than a Ukrainian capitulation still seems out of the question. At the same time, Russia has now stopped the importation of bananas from Ecuador from 5 companies out of Ecuador. They claim that it's the threat of a pest that forces them to stop it, but obviously it happened a few days after Ecuador said it's going to hand over obsolete weapons to the US, and the guess is that's going to be air defense systems that are going to be then given to Ukraine to aid them with their air defense. Troop generation, we have some information from the Ukrainian side. The draft law for the mobilization has now been signed off by the ministers and is being handed over to the parliament to decide on that. In that, the mobilization age would be reduced from 27 to 25. This is something that is mostly ignored, that the Ukrainians right now mobilize only over 27. One of the reasons why their average age has increased so much in the last year or two. So this is going to be reduced to 25 if it's signed up, which isn't perfectly certain. The last draft had been declined by the parliament, and it would mean that soldiers, mobilized personnel, would have to serve for 36 months, but then they would be dismissed, to basically give the soldiers some hope that they have to hold out until a certain point, and then they will be able to go home regardless of whether the war is won or not. Then the Russians are adjusting themselves towards the new threat of air defense. Here's a claim by a Russian Russian website, Istvesta, I think is the name, that they now add air defense to assault groups. The thing is, though, that the article doesn't make too much sense. So first of all, they say these could be air attack weapons, in particular FPV drones. So they identify FPV drones as a big problem, and then they say it's clear that you can't really shoot at such targets with manpads. It has its limitations, but when working with these complexes that track many targets, there is a guarantee that you will have minimal or no losses from enemy attacks. So if I understand that, they acknowledge you can't shoot them with manpads. And they say, but if we know they are there, we'll have less losses, which has some point. But the thing is, then they claim you can't shoot it with manpads, but they want to equip it with Tor and Gipka. Tor is a short-range missile system, surface-to-air missile system, and Gipka is this year, which is basically a high-mobility air defense running manpads. So they are going to equip them with defensive systems that are pointless against those FPV drones, instead of maybe giving it some kinetic, barrel air defense, like Shilka, like Tunguska, like Pantsir. That kind of doesn't make sense, but we'll have to see how that turns out. The Ukrainians also are reporting that Orlan reconnaissance drones that were shot down, so those are Russian ones that the Ukrainians shot down, they have discovered that those have chips in them with a emitter and a separate battery to recognize, once they have been shot down, where they are being transported to. Now there we see an innovation, obviously, where the Russians try to probably get the brains behind the information, behind the positions, by thus being able to identify where shot down equipment is being brought to, and that should be the place where the weapons experts are, and thus being able to take them out. So a really devious plan from the Russians, and I do not have a confirmation whether that plan worked, whether the Russians have been able to take out some, but here we can see some innovation by the Russians once more in this war. And in international support, the European Union has now released 50 billion euros for Ukraine. I think that should be like 55 to 58 billion US dollars. 33 billion euros are credit and 17 are not refundable. So I guess they are donation. I'm not exactly sure about the technical terms. Also, the Bulgarian 100 BTR-60 are on their way to Ukraine. Estonia has sent fresh Javelin, and Canada is checking if they can give Ukraine CRV-7. Those are unguided 70mm rockets from rocket pods that the Canadians have decommissioned more or less 20 years ago. They aren't clear whether they can still give them to them, because they were supposed to be scrapped. Some of them don't have warheads anymore, but in total it says that it's about tens of thousands of those. So that could actually be quite some nice aid for the Ukrainians should they receive those. And Zelensky said that Ukraine has received 2 new air defense systems, but it's unclear which ones. He didn't say that, and we would have to do guesswork which ones they are. He probably mentioned it also because lately the Ukrainian air defense has been somewhat less effective in shooting down Russian cruise missiles and drones in their latest attacks, obviously dependent on the targeting too. Like if the Russians found areas that are less defended, then they have a higher rate to get through anyways. But still, 2 new systems being announced by the Ukrainian government. And finally, I have a video here that shows us the construction of decoys. Now there's a fresh video of an Iris-T being hit by the Russians, and usually when you have moving parts like this, that's a fairly good way to differentiate the if it can't be a decoy, or at least that was made it less likely to be a decoy. Now we see that they're obviously building highly detailed models of the original deal, even with moving parts, probably with infrared emitters as well, to simulate engine power, etc., to eat up Russian precision munitions into some decoys, and thus wasting the ammunition. That is it from me for now for this situation report. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and leave a comment what you think about the current situation. Do you think Zaluzhnyi is likely going to be fired over the next few days, and do you think it's the right decision by Zelensky? Leave a comment that can lead to highly interesting discussions. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel, and that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.